The rain fell steadily, its monotonous patter on the windows like the breath of a city that never stops, even when everything around it dies. Gravehall was drowning in a grey haze, its streets saturated with dirt and rust, glistening under the streetlights like the skin of a sick animal. Elias Crowe sat at the desk in his cramped flat, the light from a single lamp catching his face from the gloom, haggard with deep shadows under eyes that had not seen sleep in weeks. The article lay in front of him, half written, its words burning on the screen of his laptop like an indictment. Names, sums, front companies leading to Michael Drake's election campaign. Elias knew it was dangerous, but he could not stop. The truth was his only anchor in a sea of guilt that threatened to drown him. The apartment was a crypt, its cracked walls smelling of whiskey, old newspapers, and loneliness. The shelves were groaning with files, their edges yellowed like bones long forgotten by the sun. There was a bottle on the table, half empty, its contents reflecting the lamplight like liquid gold, but Elias did not drink, not today. His fingers, trembling with fatigue, tapped out words that might be his doom. He was writing about Drake, whose smile on campaign posters was a mask hiding the rot. But each paragraph was like stepping on thin ice, and he could feel the ice cracking under his feet. The sound of the mailbox cut through the silence like a knife. Elias froze, his heart pounding like a drum in an empty hall. He walked to the door, his steps slow as if he were going to the gallows. There was an envelope in the mailbox, no stamp, no address, just his name, written in black ink that seemed too thick like blood. He tore the paper, his fingers shaking, and a piece of paper fell out. "You will pay like them," it read, the letters uneven, as if the writer was barely containing his rage. Elias felt a chill run down his spine, his breath ragged like fabric. Torn by claws, he slumped into a chair, the paper still in his hand, the words burning into his skin. Like them, Laura and Emily. 5 years ago, their car had burst into flames on a lonely road, flames eating through the metal, and the police had called it an accident. Faulty wiring, an accident. But Elias knew the truth. His story about the ironclad group, a construction empire whose multi-million-dollar contracts reeked of corruption, had led to the arrest of its leader, but it had cost him everything. Laura, whose smile had been a light in his dark world, and Emily, whose laughter rang in his ears even now, had been the price of his truth. He saw their faces every time he closed his eyes, Laura with her dark hair, Emily with the pigtails she had proudly shown him before school. Now they were ashes, and he was a shadow that could not let them go. Elias stood, his legs heavy as if the floor were coated in tar. He walked to the window, his breath leaving a trail on the glass, as murky as his thoughts. The street below was empty, just the rain pounding the asphalt, but he could feel the gaze, invisible but sharp as a blade. He knew this was not the first threat. Over the years, his writing had made him enemies, whose names he had scribbled in a notebook he kept under his mattress. But this letter was different. It knew his pain, knew where to cut deep. He poured the whiskey, his hand shaking, but he didn't drink. Instead, he pulled out an old photograph of Laura and Emily on the beach, their faces glowing in a sun that now seemed like a mirage. He ran his finger along the glass of the frame, his throat tightening, but no tears would come. He hadn't cried since their funeral, but every day he felt their absence carving chunks out of his soul. "I'll find you," he whispered, his voice hoarse, like a whisper from the grave. but there was steel in it. In the morning, he drove to the newspaper office, his car creaking as he turned the corners, rain trickling down his windscreen like tears he couldn't shed. The offices of the Gravehall Shadow, an independent publication, were tucked into the basement of an old building, the walls smelling of damp and the lights flickering as if they couldn't decide whether to live or die. Claire Moore, the editor, sat at her desk, her glasses reflecting the light from her computer screen, her face tired but sharp as a knife. "You look like shit," she said, her voice dry but with a concern she'd never acknowledged. Elias dropped the envelope on the table, his fingers still shaking. "This came yesterday," he said, and the words hung in the air, heavy as lead. Claire read the note, her brow furrowed, but she didn't say anything banal like, "Be careful." Instead, she pulled out a folder, its edges dog-eared like a book that had been read too often. "Here's what we found," she said, her voice a whisper of wind before a storm. The folder contained statements, transfers to Drake's campaign, funneled through shell companies whose names were parodies of honesty. Horizon Trust, Bright Future LLC. Elias flipped through the pages, his eyes darting over the numbers, and he felt a fire ignite inside him. Not hope, but a rage that kept him going. He got home late. The rain had gotten heavier, the drops hitting the pavement like bullets. The door to his apartment was ajar, though he'd locked it. He walked in, his hand clutching the pocket knife, his heart pounding like a metronome in agony. It was quiet inside, but the air was heavy, as if someone had breathed in this room before. Him. There was a photograph on the table. Laura, her eyes cut out and black ink drawn around them like tears. Elias froze, his breath caught, the world narrowing to that image. He knew it wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. He collapsed into a chair, his hands shaking, but he did not cry. Instead, he pulled out a notebook, its pages covered with the names of enemies, dates, clues. He added a new line. They know. He did not know who they were, but he felt them close, their shadow already cast over his life. He looked at the photograph of Laura and Emily, their faces like a beacon in the night, but the light was distant, almost unreachable. "I will find you," he whispered again, and his voice was an oath carved in stone. The rain pounded outside, the window, its rhythm eternal as time. And Elias knew this was only the beginning. Gravehall was damp and dark, its streets pulsing like veins with the weight of the rain that never stopped, as if mourning something long forgotten. Elias Crowe sat in his flat, the window open, the cold air creeping in, mixing with the smell of wet paper and old wood. The knife was still stuck in the desk, its blade caught in the light of a street lamp and flung against the wall like a killer's grin. The note lay nearby, its ink-scraped letters alive, whispering, "You're next." He left the knife there, a reminder, a challenge. He opened the notebook again, his ink-stained fingers turning the pages until they came to a name, Nathan Vale. The memory of him was like shards of glass in a fog. Nathan, a boy with spindly hands and a yearning gaze, vowing to avenge his father, whose life had been destroyed by Elias's article. It had seemed a small thing then, the exposure of a petty bribe-taker, the young journalist's first victory. Now it came back like an echo, amplified by years of hatred. Elias felt his heart tightening, as if someone were tightening a noose around his neck. There was a sound outside, the squeal of tires on wet pavement, too slow to be accidental. He went to the window, his breath steaming on the glass. The car was parked below, black and unmarked, its headlights off but its engine humming quietly, like an animal holding its breath. Elias froze, his fingers gripping the sill, his nails digging into the wood. The car sat there for a minute, maybe two, and then drove away, disappearing into the night like a ghost, leaving behind only puddles shivering in the rain. He knew it was no coincidence. They were watching. They were waiting. He came back to the table, his movements jerky like a man afraid to stop. He pulled an old photograph of Nathan out of a box hidden under the floorboards, a picture from their senior year, shoulder to shoulder, both thin, both with hope in their eyes. Nathan had been smiling, but even then there had been something taut in his smile, like a string about to snap. Elias ran his finger over the picture as if he could erase the years, but instead he felt only the coldness of the paper. He dropped the photograph onto the table, next to the knife, and the edges curled like a book that had been read too often. The phone rang, its trill cutting through the silence like a knife through flesh. Elias picked it up, his hand shaking but his voice firm. "Who is it?" There was silence on the other end of the line, only breathing, heavy, wet, as if someone had been standing in the rain. Then there was laughter, low, guttural, full of malice. "You're digging a grave, Crowe," the voice said, the words falling slowly like drops of water in a basement. "But not your own?" The line went dead, leaving only the beeping, ringing in his ears like the echoes of a gunshot. He threw the phone down on the table and collapsed into a chair, his fingers digging into his hair. A grave. Not his. That meant Claire, or whoever, had dared to stand next to him. He remembered the look in her eyes in the newsroom, not just fear but something deeper, as if she knew the shadow of an enemy had already touched her. He grabbed his coat, the material cold and damp, and ran. Outside, the rain lashed his face, trickled down his collar, but he didn't notice. He had to find her before it was too late. The office was dark except for a single lamp shining through a crack in the door. Elias walked in, his boots leaving dirty marks on the floor. Claire was sitting at her desk, her face as pale as paper, another folder in front of her. "You should see this," she said, her voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. He took the folder, his fingers leaving wet spots on the cover. There were photographs inside, the informant's body taken from different angles, his throat cut like a smile, his eyes open and empty. And in one of them, in the corner, was a shadow, a cloaked figure barely visible, but Elias knew it was no accident. "They were here," Claire whispered, her hands clenching into fists. "I heard footsteps outside the door." Elias looked at her, his eyes hard, but inside he felt something crumbling. He put his hand on her shoulder, his fingers cold, but the gesture warm, like a promise. "We'll find them," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. He took the photographs in the folder, stuffed them under his coat, and they walked out into the night where the rain still fell, washing away the tracks, but not the fear. They drove in the car, silent, the only sound being the scraping of the windshield wipers. Elias turned down an alley where the streetlights were dim, their light as dim as the eyes of a dying man. He stopped at an abandoned bar whose sign hung crookedly like a broken bone. "Why are we here?" Claire asked, her voice quiet but steely. Elias didn't answer, but got out and headed for the back door, his footsteps crunching on broken glass. It was dark inside, smelling of mildew and cheap whiskey. The bartender, An old man with a face as lined as a map nodded at him without asking questions. Elias walked into the back room where a man sat, thin and fearful-eyed, his hands shaking as he poured himself a drink. "You're late," he said, his voice hoarse like a whisper from the grave. "They know." Elias sat down across from him, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Who knows?" he asked, his voice a blade ready to cut. "And what exactly do they know?" The man took a sip of whiskey, his Adam's apple bobbing as if he'd swallowed poison. "Drake's money isn't just bribes," he said, the words falling slowly, like drops of blood. "It's a system. The police, the mayor's office, business, it's all tied together. And Nathan Vale, he's not just a vigilante, he's their dog." Elias felt his stomach clench, as if someone had punched him in the gut. He remembered Nathan, the boy who'd sworn revenge, and the man whose eyes were as empty as a gun barrel. "Where is he?" Elias asked, his voice quiet, but menacing. The man shook his head, his hands shaking more violently. "I don't know, but he's close. He's always close." Elias stood, his fingers digging into the back of his chair. "If you're lying," he began, but the man interrupted. "I'm not lying. Look at me, I'm already dead." His eyes, full of horror, spoke the truth. Elias walked out, his footsteps echoing in the empty bar, and behind him he heard a man crying, quietly, like a child who has lost everything. Back in the car, he started the engine without a word. Claire looked at him, her face pale but her eyes bright. "What next?" she asked, her voice a challenge. Elias gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. "The truth next," he said, and the words hung in the air, heavy as lead. He knew the truth was not salvation, but a death sentence, but he could not stop. The rain poured down, washing away the tracks, but not the fear, and Gravehall waited, holding his breath, like an animal about to spring. Elias Crowe pressed himself against the cold side of the shipping container, his fingers clammy from the rain as he clutched his camera, the lens trained on the warehouse across the road. The industrial docks were a maze of rusty metal and shadows, where the smell of fuel oil and rotting water was choking, and the creaking of cranes in the distance was a death rattle. He stood in the darkness, his heart pounding like a hammer, when he spotted Roy Talbot, a detective whose uniform gleamed in the dim light of a street lamp, marking him out like a beacon in the night. Talbot was speaking to two figures in expensive coats, their faces hidden but their gestures exuding authority. Elias clicked the shutter, the sound barely audible, but it seemed to echo across the empty docks. He knew it was no accident. Claire's file, the photos of the dead informant, the bartender's words about the system where Drake's money flowed through the police. It all led here, to these warehouses, where the truth hid behind walls of rust and salt. Elias took another picture, his fingers shaking, but the lens caught the moment. Talbot handed an envelope, thick as a wad of bills, to one of the men. A chill ran down his spine, not from the dampness but from the knowledge that he had witnessed a deal that would kill. He retreated deeper into the shadows, his boots squelching through the puddles, his mind racing like a caged animal. This wasn't just dirt. It was a ticket to the grave. The memories came back like a wave, dark and suffocating. Nathan Vale, a boy from his youth whose father, a minor government official, had been crushed by Elias's graft story. Elias had seen it as justice back then, at 18, but Nathan's eyes, full of hatred, told a different story. "You destroyed my family," He had screamed, his voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. "I will make you pay." Nathan had disappeared after high school, but now his name had surfaced in Claire's files. An alias, a shadowy firm, connections to Drake's finances. Elias could feel Nathan close, his shadow on every step, like ashes on glass. He tucked the camera under his coat, his fingers numb from the cold, and moved along the containers, careful not to step on the broken glass that littered the ground. The docks were deserted, only the water lapping against the concrete, the sound like a whisper full of menace. He reached the corner of the warehouse, where the light of the lantern did not reach, and froze. Footsteps. Quiet but clear, like the ticking of a clock. Someone was following him, their shadow flickering on the wall, long and curved like a knife. Elias clutched the switchblade in his pocket, its blade cold as the truth he sought. He turned, but it was empty. Only the rain pounding the metal, mocking his fear. He returned to the car, parked half a mile away, its rusty frame blending into the darkness. It was damp inside, the smell of petrol and wet cloth choking him, but Elias didn't notice, his mind busy with the pictures. He inserted the memory card into his laptop, the screen illuminating his face, pale and drawn, like a man who had long forgotten what peace was. The photographs were clear. Talbot, the envelope, the faces of the men, one of whom he recognized as Drake's assistant, whose smile on the posters promised a clean city. Elias clenched his teeth, his jaw aching. This was no mere conspiracy. It was a web entangled in Gravehall, and he held the thread in his hands. He drove to the abandoned printing press where Claire had promised to meet. The building sat on the edge of an industrial park, its cracked walls smelling of ink and dust. The windows were boarded up, but light filtered through the cracks like a blade cutting through the darkness. Elias walked in, his footsteps echoing in the empty space, the shadows on the walls shifting as if alive. Claire sat at an old printing press, her laptop flickering like a beacon in a storm. "You're late," she said, her voice quiet but filled with an anxiety she was trying to hide. Elias dropped the flash drive on the table, its plastic clanking against metal. "This changes everything," he said, his words heavy as lead. Claire plugged in the drive, her fingers flying across the keyboard until the images filled the screen. She was silent, but her breathing was quickening, as if she were running. "Talbot works for Drake," she whispered, her eyes darting over the images. "But that's not all." She pulled up the database she'd hacked the day before, its entries a maze leading to the truth. Nathan Vale's name popped up on a list of employees at Horizon Trust, the shell company whose accounts had fed Drake's campaign. But there was another name next to it, a pseudonym Elias didn't recognize, but he felt the cold tightening in his chest. "He's here," he said, his voice hoarse like a whisper from beyond the grave. "Nathan. He's always been here." Claire looked at him, her eyes full of fear, but she didn't back down. "We can publish this," she said, her words a challenge. "But they'll come for us." Elias nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. He knew the price of the truth. Laura and Emily had paid it in full. But he couldn't stop, not with Nathan's shadow so close he could feel its breath on the back of his neck. They left the print shop, but the night lingered. On the way back, Elias caught the glow of headlights in his rear-view mirror. A car, black, no number plates, keeping its distance but keeping up. He turned into an alley, his heart pounding like a drum, but the car followed. Claire squeezed his hand, her fingers cold as ice. "Drive," she whispered, and he stepped on the gas, the tires squealing on the wet pavement. The alley narrowed, trash cans flashing by like ghosts. But the car kept up, its headlights like the eyes of a predator. Suddenly something hit the rear window, a crack like a gunshot, and the glass cracked. Elias swerved, the car slamming into a dumpster, debris flying like ash. He jumped out, dragging Claire with him, and they ran, their footsteps drowning in the roar of the rain. The alley led to an abandoned factory, its gates open like the mouth of a beast. They ran inside, the darkness swallowing them, the smell of rust and chemicals burning their lungs. Elias pinned Claire against the wall, his hand clutching his knife, his eyes searching the darkness for movement. The footsteps were coming closer, slow, sure, like a hunter who knows his prey is trapped. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted, black against the headlights. Elias couldn't see the face, but he knew it was him. Nathan. His voice, low and cold as steel, cut through the silence. "You thought I'd forgotten, Elias?" The words were like a blow, and Elias felt his knees buckle. He wanted to answer, but his throat tightened like a noose. The figure took a step closer, but then the wail of sirens sounded, and it retreated, disappearing into the night like smoke. Elias and Claire slipped out the back, their clothes wet with sweat and rain. They reached a motel on the outskirts, its neon sign blinking like a distress signal. In the room, Elias collapsed on the bed, his body shaking but his mind sharp as a blade. He pulled out the photograph of Laura and Emily, its edges crumpled, but their faces as vivid as the memory that burned inside him. He stitched up the wound on his arm from the escape, the needle shaking in his fingers as the blood dripped onto the floor, mixing with the dirt. Claire sat across from him, her eyes full of questions but silent. Elias looked in the mirror above the sink and thought he saw Laura standing there, behind his reflection, her face sad but her voice silent. He turned away, his fists clenched, and he knew that the truth he sought was closer than ever, and it was killing him. Elias Crowe stood in the shadow of a rusty gate, his breath the hiss of the rain falling on the roof of an abandoned factory. The place smelled of chemicals and rot, and the darkness was so thick it seemed alive, shifting like a web, ready to catch him. He clutched the recorder, the plastic cold and slick with sweat, and his fingers trembled, but not with fear, with a sense that the truth he sought was here, beyond these walls, and it could kill him. Nathan Vale, his shadow from the past, was somewhere inside, and Elias knew this night would not end without bloodshed. The factory was a far cry from the dockside, warehouses or the stuffy motel where he'd licked his wounds the night before. Its concrete walls, cracked and graffitied, echoed with the sounds of long-since stopped machinery, and the floor was littered with broken glass that crunched like bones underfoot. Elias moved slowly, his footsteps barely audible, drowned out by the dripping rain from the ceiling. He'd been following Nathan for 2 days, tracking him through the Horizon Trust accounts Claire had hacked. Nathan wasn't just a vigilante, he was a system dog, laundering money for Drake, and Elias was going to catch him red-handed. He stopped at the rusted stairs leading to the second floor, where dim light filtered through a broken window. Voices came from above, low and sharp, like blades cutting the air. Elias turned on the recorder, his heart pounding like a metronome in agony, and began to climb, each step creaking as if warning of a trap. On the landing, he pressed himself against the wall, his coat catching on the rough concrete, his eyes searching the gloom for movement. Nathan stood in the center of the room, his figure illuminated by a lantern resting on a crate. He was talking to two men, their faces hidden, but their voices were familiar. Drake's men, the same ones who had met Talbot at the docks. Elias aimed the recorder, his microphone catching every word. Amounts, dates, names, the web of corruption he had spent his life searching for. But then Nathan fell silent, his head turning as if he felt someone watching him. Elias held his breath, his fingers gripping the recorder so tightly the plastic cracked. "You're here, aren't you, Elias?" Nathan said, his voice cold as steel, but there was a pain in it as old as their childhood. The men turned, thereby hands reaching for their guns, but Nathan held up a hand to stop them. "Go away," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. They disappeared into the darkness, their footsteps fading like the echo of a gunshot, and Elias knew he was alone, with the ghost of his past. He stepped forward, the light from the lantern falling on his face, pale and drawn, his eyes full of rage and guilt. Nathan looked at him, his face, once familiar, now alien. Lines, scars, eyes as empty as a gun barrel. "You haven't changed," Nathan said, his lips twisting into a sneer but his voice shaking. Still the same righteous man ruining lives for his words. Elias gritted his teeth, his jaw aching. "You killed them," he said, the words like a blow, but there was a crack in them, like glass ready to shatter. "Laura, Emily, it was you." Nathan laughed, his laugh harsh as the sound of ripping paper. But his eyes were wet, as if rain had seeped inside. "You think I wanted this?" he said, his voice quieter but sharper. "You destroyed my family, Elias. Your article took my father, my mother, my life. I was nothing until they found me." He stepped closer, his coat rustling like a raven's wings. "I didn't kill them, but I didn't stop the ones who did. And you know why? Because you deserved to hurt." Elias felt his knees buckle, as if the floor had fallen away beneath him. Memories came like poison. Nathan, the boy who had shared cigarettes with him behind the school, whose father had been arrested because of his article. Elias saw the truth in it, but he did not see the consequences. Nathan's mother dying of grief, himself vanished into the shadows of Gravehall. He wanted to answer, but the words stuck in his throat like bones. Nathan pulled out his gun, the barrel glinting like the eye of an animal, but he did not fire. "You're already dead inside," he said, his voice almost gentle, like an executioner, pitying his victim. "Go home, Elias. Live with it." He threw something on the floor, a photograph, an old one from their graduation of them standing together, laughing. Then he was gone, his footsteps disappearing into the roar of the rain, and Elias was left standing, clutching the recorder like the last thread to reality. He walked back to the car, his body shaking but his mind sharp as a blade. He had the tape, the evidence that could cut Drake's web. He didn't go to the motel, but to Laura's old house on the outskirts of town, where they had lived before she died. It was empty, its walls smelling of damp and neglect, its windows coated with dust like a shroud. Elias walked in, his footsteps echoing in the silence, every corner a blow. Here Laura cooking dinner, there Emily drawing on the floor with chalk. He found her journal in a dresser drawer, its pages as brittle as dry leaves. He leafed through them, his fingers shaking, and each word was a knife. Elias is digging too deep. I'm afraid for him. For us. She knew his truth would kill them, but she kept quiet lest she break him. Elias collapsed on the floor, the journal clutched to his chest, his breath ragged like fabric torn by claws. He saw her face, her eyes full of love and fear, and he felt the guilt burning inside him. He pulled out his phone and sent the recording. To Claire, his message short: publish. But then, he heard the sirens, their howl like an animal's cry, and he knew the police were already looking for him. Talbot, Drake, the system. They knew he was close, and they weren't going to let him go alive. He left the house, leaving the journal on the table, its pages fluttering in the wind like the wings of a dead bird. The rain lashed his face, but he didn't notice. His mind was on Nathan, on his words, on his gun that hadn't fired. Elias knew the truth he'd written down was his final blow, but it wouldn't bring Laura back. It wouldn't bring Emily back. It wouldn't bring him back. He disappeared into the night, his shadow on the pavement, long and crooked, like a scar that would never heal. Elias Crowe crept through the back entrance of City Hall, his shadow sliding across the marble. Floors like a stain no one wanted to see. The archives on the lower level smelled of dust and old paper, their silence heavy as a tombstone, broken only by the creak of his boots and the distant hum of the ventilation system. He clutched his flashlight, its beam flickering, picking out. From the darkness, the rows of shelves filled with files that held Gravehall's secrets, names, deals, deaths, disguised as statistics. Elias knew this was his last chance. The tape he'd given Claire had already gone to press, but without documents linking the ironclad group to Laura and Emily's murder, his truth would be a scream in the void. The archives were a labyrinth, a far cry from the rusting factory or Laura's empty house where he'd left her journal as a farewell. Here the walls were cold as dead skin, and the air thick with the smell of ink and mildew. Elias moved quickly, his fingers leafing through the files, their edges cutting his skin like knives. He was looking for a case from 5 years ago, an arson the police had called an accident, but which had taken his family. His heart pounded like a drum, every sound like the footsteps of an enemy. But he didn't stop. Nathan Vale was somewhere nearby. Elias could smell him, like an animal could smell blood. He found the folder, its cover tattered but the words, Incident, 3/17/2020, glowing in the light like an indictment. Inside were documents, reports, photos of the burned car, signatures that shouldn't have been there. The name Ironclad Group was written across the pages like poison mixed with ink, and next to it was a nickname he recognized, Shadow. Nathan Vale, their enforcer, the man who had set the car on fire on orders from the elite. Elias clenched, his teeth, his jaw aching, and a fire blazed in his chest, not of rage but of the pain that had burned through him for 5 years. He shoved the folder under his coat, his hands shaking but his mind sharp as a blade. Footsteps came from behind. Him? Slow, sure, like an executioner's approaching the scaffold. Elias turned, his flashlight illuminating Nathan's face. The scars, the wrinkles, the eyes, empty but full of something that wasn't just hate. "You found what you wanted," Nathan said, his voice low as an engine, but cracked, like broken glass. "But it won't change anything." He held the gun, the barrel pointed at Elias's chest, but his finger wasn't on the trigger. Elias stepped forward, his flashlight falling, the light dancing across the walls like a madman. "You killed them," he said, the words like a blow, but there was a plea in them. "Why?" Nathan laughed, his laugh bitter as the taste of ash. "I didn't mean to," he said, his eyes shining as if rain had seeped inside. "But you gave me a choice. Your article took everything. My father, my mother, me. I was nothing until they gave me a purpose." He stepped closer, his gun lowering but not disappearing. "I set fire to the car, but the order came from above. You think Drake or Talbot get their hands dirty? They just point and I was their shadow." Elias felt the floor shift beneath his feet, as if the truth he sought was not salvation, but poison. The memories came flooding back. Nathan, the boy who had shared cigarettes with him, whose life had been destroyed by his words. Elias had seen the truth in his article, but he hadn't seen how it had crushed his friend's family, how it had made Nathan what he had become. "We both failed," Nathan had said, his voice quiet as a whisper from the grave, and Elias knew it was not a threat but a sentence. He lunged forward, his fist hitting Nathan in the face, the gun clattering on the concrete, and they grappled, their bodies smashing against the shelves, files falling like leaves in a storm. Nathan was stronger, his hands tightening around Elias's throat. But Elias twisted away, the knife hidden in his sleeve plunging into his enemy's shoulder. Nathan screamed, his blood splattering onto the floor, but he didn't back down. He slashed at Elias's chest, and Elias collapsed, his breath ragged like fabric torn by claws. Nathan raised his gun, his hand shaking but his eyes steady. "You won't save them," he said, and fired. The bullet entered Elias's side, the pain like fire, burning everything inside. He fell, his hand still clutching the folder, as if it could stop the bleeding. Nathan stood over him, his face a mask of pain and rage. "We both lost," he repeated, his voice breaking like a branch in the wind. He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading, and Elias lay there, blood running across the floor, mixing with the dust. He took out his phone, his fingers shaking, and sent a photo of the documents to Claire, his message short. "It's all here." Then he lost consciousness, darkness swallowing him, but there were faces in it. Laura, Emily, their eyes full of love but without words. He woke up in a hospital, its walls white but smelling of death, its lamplight cutting into his eyes like a knife. His side had been stitched up, but the pain was still there, not physical, but a different kind that lived in his bones. Claire sat next to him, her face pale but her eyes ablaze. "You did it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The stories out. Drake on trial, Talbot arrested. She showed him the newspaper, its headlines screaming, "Gravehall corruption, the truth revealed." But Elias felt no victory. He stared out the window, where the rain trickled down the glass like tears he had no more. Nathan was dead, found that morning, a bullet in his chest, in an alley where he must have bled to death like a hunted animal. Elias knew it wasn't his knife. It wasn't his bullet. The system was eliminating witnesses like garbage. He closed his eyes and Laura and Emily appeared before him, their faces clear as that day on the beach, but their voices silent. He knew the truth he had wrested from Gravehall wouldn't bring them back, wouldn't bring him back. His name was blackened. The police had declared him a fugitive, and he knew he would not walk out of that hospital free. He stood, his legs shaking, but he went to the window, his fingers touching the cold glass. Gravehall lay below, its lights flickering like stars in agony, and Elias felt the city watching him, like an animal he had wounded but not killed. Laura's voice sounded in his head, soft but distant. "You did what you could. He smiled, his lips cracking and blood pooling on them, but he did not notice. He turned and walked out of the room, his steps as soft as a whisper, his shadow on the floor like ashes that the wind would never blow away.